All right, we talked about the beginning stuff here about Deng Xiaoping, but most classes we hadn't gotten to the bottom part of this slide. So, just to review, Deng Xiaoping had sent thousands of Chinese students to the West to study. And some of them come home, some of them stay in the United States, but the ones that come back to China come back not only with technical knowledge, but with ideas about democracy and freedom of speech. And so a bunch of these students in Beijing start a protest in the Tiananmen Square, which is the main square, the biggest square in China, in Beijing. I've been there and they'll tell you it's the biggest square in the world. I don't know if it is, but it is very large. And they start this very peaceful protest, probably the most peaceful protest that I have ever seen on live on TV. They built a statue that kind of looked like the Statue of Liberty. They were very polite in how they were made in their demands. They were like, we'd just like to talk about democracy or about freedom, and they were. It wasn't like disruptive or violent. But Deng Xiaoping, this guy who's opening up China, responds with violence. He sends in tanks. He sends in the police. People are arrested. People are shot. It was not a violent protest, but the response of the government was complete and total smackdown. And probably the most famous picture from this time period is, and I'll show you right now, is this one. Not over here, one more. This one. Generally, we just call this guy in front of these tanks, we call him Tank Man because nobody knows who he is. And now I'm going to put in this video, another video that kind of tells the story of this picture.
I got there about a week before the crackdown, and it was a very lively event, almost a carnival atmosphere. You had children dancing, and people were singing. Even policemen were singing together with the protesters. It was well organized, and I think everybody knew that this couldn't keep going on forever. And I didn't think it was going to go on forever. And we were all just sort of wondering what the Chinese government was going to do to these protesters. One picture that I photographed of a woman being caught in the middle of many soldiers near the Great Hall of the People, in my mind, is where it started. The evening of June 3rd was the time when things really started heating up, and so all the protesters started bringing steel barricades and putting them in the middle of the street to block the advance of the soldiers who might be coming that night. And I was talking to my reporter, and then we heard this noise of metal crashing on the ground, and we're all thinking, what's going on? You know, what's happening? Then this armored personnel carrier comes around the corner so fast that there's sparks coming off the treads. Everybody was running and screaming, and I ran off and jumped into some ivy. And then I had to pull myself up and go running after this armored car when I really just wanted to run in the opposite direction. When I got there, my battery power on my flash was almost zero, and I could only take one picture every 60 seconds. So imagine on one of the largest stories of the 20th century, and you can only take one picture every minute while all hell's breaking loose. One man was on the ground, on fire, rolling around. Another man was helping him, and I'm just going, come on, come on, come on. And the flash would not recycle, and I'm waiting, which seemed to be an eternity. And I lifted it to my eye, and the minute I lifted it to my eye, my neck snapped back. I looked down, blood's all over me, and I had a massive concussion from a brick from a protester had thrown. And I looked at the back of the armored car that was on fire, and this is now getting very close to midnight. And then out came a soldier to surrender. He had his hands up in the air. And I still remember that pristine look of his uniform, how pressed it was. It was clear as day in my mind. I remember it so clearly. And the mob looked at him for a second, and then they slowly moved in, and they had pipes and they had weapons of all kinds, and they started beating on him. And I looked at that, and I couldn't take a picture. And I thought to myself, I'm going to lose the Pulitzer Prize. And then I thought to myself, I should be ashamed for thinking something like that because he's about to die. I was not staying at the Beijing Hotel, but the Beijing Hotel was the location closest to the Tiananmen Square. This is where journalists were going, trying to get some kind of an idea on what was going on. And everybody was scared. I've never been so scared. Out of all the assignments I've been on, I've never been so scared as this story. Fortunately, I managed to get to the Beijing Hotel, and we made it to the roof. I went out to the balcony, and I kept looking at the bullet hole over my head because there was one bullet hole. It kept reminding me that I could easily get picked off by a sniper. So it was very unsettling to be leaning over a balcony and trying to shoot around a wall. And the man walks out in the middle of the street with his shopping bags, and the first thing I told Kirk, I said, this guy's going to screw up my composition. So Kirk's looking at me, and he's saying, they're going to kill that guy. They're going to shoot him. So I'm focusing, waiting for the man to be shot. And I'm just waiting and waiting. I know it's going to happen. I mean, they're not going to let him get away with this. And I'm waiting, and I'm focusing and waiting, and nothing happens. And then I'm thinking, you know, this picture's too far away. It's just too far away. And I'm looking at the bed, and I'm thinking, do I take a gamble and get this teleconverter? So I get the teleconverter, I gamble, I put it on the lens, I go 1, 2, 3. I wonder what happened to him, like anyone, but the big question is, it's shocking that after a quarter of a century, not only we do not know where he is, we don't know where his relatives are. You'd think a relative would come forward. And what happened to the tank crew? What happened to the driver? What happened to the crew? They've disappeared off the face of the planet. I mean, those guys have lives, they've got families, where are they? Where is everybody? It's like the Twilight Zone, they just disappeared.
So here's the key thing. Deng Xiaoping makes China what China is today. China today has a thriving economy, and he opened the door for all of that. China today, despite what our president says right now, has a better relationship with the West. Deng Xiaoping did that. But China today is also not a place that you can have political freedom. All right, now we're going to go on to India. So Indira Gandhi is not related to Mahatma Gandhi, the famous Gandhi. She's actually the daughter of Nehru, who we talked about before. He was another guy who didn't want to get involved in the Cold War. And she's kind of a controversial leader because there was a lot of problems during when she was running India. There were food shortages. India still today, as back then, was overpopulated. India is the second largest population in the entire world. And there's a lot of ethnic strife. We've talked about this before. There's tons of ethnic groups, religious groups, different castes within Hinduism. And she tries to forcibly sterilize certain groups of people in the society. Sterilized means that, it's like being fixed like a dog. You can't have kids. And of course, she doesn't go after her own group and goes after other groups, minority groups, people of lower caste. And this causes riots throughout India. But she was trying to deal with a real problem. Forcing people into sterilization might have not been the best choice. But an even worse choice that she made was this next one, which is the second to last big bullet. She attacks a Sikh temple, like the holiest of Sikh temples. She orders her army in and attacks Sikhs. Why there's a lot of ethnic strife, and they were part of the ethnic strife, but this is gonna not only cause more tension. I mean, imagine somebody marches, an army and attacks the Pope. I mean, Catholics everywhere would be up in arms. Of course, the Sikhs are upset by this. And then this is the really stupid part, that one of her bodyguards was a Sikh. Like, after you go into the holiest temple, maybe you shouldn't hire Sikh bodyguards. But she did, and she ends up being killed by that bodyguard. In the 80s, or late 70s, early 80s, there starts to be a change in the Middle East. So one of the first changes is that the Arab states around Israel realize going to war with Israel is no longer a good idea. We've lost every single time. Egypt, who has been in practically every one of those wars that we went through, the Sinai War, the Civil War, or the Arab-Israeli War, they've been in almost all of them. The leader of Egypt sits down with the leader of Israel. So Anwar Sadat is Egyptian. Menachem Begin is the Israeli. And this is all negotiated by Jimmy Carter, the US president. And they sit down and sign a peace treaty. And this is a huge deal. I mean, they've fought so many wars together, and now they're at peace. All of them won a Nobel Prize for this. And up until relatively recently, it's one of Egypt and Israel. You can't go to Israel. Israel won't let you in if you come from, and I mean just even fly from a Muslim country like Saudi Arabia or Jordan or Syria and try to come to Israel. They will not let you in. You're not allowed to enter the country from those countries. But Egypt is the only Muslim majority country in the Middle East that they're allowed to, and it's because of this peace treaty. Now this has changed a little bit because just in the last couple of years, Egypt's had a new government, and I'm not exactly sure about the status right this second. But for many years, it was the only country. Like you could go to Egypt and then go to Israel and visit both. But with the rest of the Arab world no longer interested in fighting Israel, there still are the Palestinians in Israel who have issues with the state of Israel. And that doesn't leave them a lot of options. They don't have a lot of rights in the government. They don't have so they just didn't feel it. So they turn to alternative means. And one of these alternative means is terrorism. So for a very long time, the PLO, which is the Palestinian Liberation Organization, tried to rule Palestine from overseas where some of them were hiding. They tried to manage those lands, but they also were a terrorist organization. And it is in the 1980s when really terrorism picks up in Israel. But then in the 1990s, that same guy from that same organization, Yasser Arafat, who was the leader of the PLO, a terrorist organization, sits down with the leader of Israel at the time, Yitzhak Rabin, and with another American president, this time it's Bill Clinton, and they negotiate peace. And so the PLO stops doing terrorist attacks, and in return, some of those Palestinian territories that the Israelis had won in the various wars, where all the Palestinians live, they were given autonomy, so some amount of self-rule. Like they're allowed to have elections and deal with their own internal affairs. Problem is today is that they keep on electing different terrorist organizations in the Palestinian territories, which is a threat to Israel, which then causes more conflict. So it didn't really solve the problem. But so in the 80s, they tried terrorism. 90s, they tried peace, and it doesn't go. But also in the 80s, they have the Intifada. This isn't terrorism. This is violent protest. So like Palestinian young men, you can see them here cover their faces, and the reason their faces are covered is not because they're afraid of being found out, is because they're likely to have tear gas thrown at them. And they start throwing rocks at soldiers and light things on fire, and then throw Molotov cocktails. A Molotov cocktail is like a bottle filled with gasoline, and then you light it on fire and throw it at something, and then it burns whatever. And then the Israeli soldiers shoot rubber bullets at them, and then sometimes it escalates to flat out shooting. But these were like uprisings, just of like mostly kids in the Israeli army would have these little skirmishes, and they call that the Intifada, which means uprising. There's more than one, but this is the first one. And then again in the 90s, we have, to remind you on the last slide, there is a peace treaty, but occasionally there's still an uprising. The Iranian Revolution is going to have an impact on its neighbor, Iraq. So let me tell you a little bit about Iran and Iraq before we get to the next slide. So if you can see the map here, Iran is that big country on the right? Kind of a bluish color on this map. Iraq is its neighbor, right? Iran is what used to be Persia, so ethnically sort of different. Most people in Iraq are Arabs, and most people in Iran are Persians. Also, most people in Iran are Shia Muslims, who are the minority in the world, but in Iran it's practically everyone in Iran is a Shia. But in Iraq, the population of Iraq is predominantly Muslim. Obviously, in our community, we know the Chaldeans come from Iraq and they're Christians, but most of the people in Iraq, not Christian. It's like a ridiculously large amount. It's in the high 90 percentile of being a Muslim. But 60% of the Muslims in Iraq are Shia, like they are in Iran, whereas 40% are Sunni. So the majority of Iraqi Muslims are Shia. But so this is an issue for Iraq because the leader of the country by this point that we're talking about is a man named Saddam Hussein, who you've heard of. Saddam Hussein and his political party, the Ba'ath Party, are Sunni Muslims. They are the minority Muslim group. And then next door, you have a revolution that turns out to be a religious revolution. Saddam Hussein is worried that his Muslims, his Shias, are going to try to join Iran. All right, so that's what leads to this. Hold on, I'm going to have to click twice because now you get to see, this is the view that I see when I'm doing notes, but I will make that go away. All right, and make it like this, which is more like what you're used to seeing. So after the revolution in Iran, there begins a war between Iran and Iraq. And Saddam Hussein and against Ayatollah Khomeini. Now this war is a terrible, terrible war. There's also, there's some territory they're arguing about, but there's a religious root to this. But the tactics that they use are astoundingly terrible. They're using World War I type tactics. They're using landmines and barbed wire and trenches and poison gas. This is a brutal war. When I was in high school and I read a news story that about this war. I mean, by the time I was in high school, this war was already over, but I'd read an old news story, and it talked about one way the Iranians were sweeping for mines because they had used up so many of their young men who could fight in the war. And they didn't really have mine dogs or robots or anything like that. They took young children and told them to hold hands and told them to walk across the minefield. And of course, some children would find mines and would be blown to bits. And then they'd send their army across. Now, this is a brutal war. And in the end, neither of them win. Nobody wins anything. They just finally stop it. And in this war, the United States officially supported Iraq. In other words, we gave arms and money to Saddam Hussein, who the name should sound familiar because we end up fighting Saddam Hussein. But also, we gave money to Iran, which was against the law because we're supposed to have no relationship with Iran after the hostage crisis. But our people on President Reagan's staff secretly funneled funds and money, and that is what funds are. I mean, funds and guns and other weapons to Iran. And there was hearings, and it was brought into the public. This is why Miss Samal knows I'm not a genius and know the inner workings of presidents, but I can read a newspaper. And so this war was pointless, and the U.S. government ends up funding somebody who's going to use those same weapons against us, Saddam Hussein. This is when the U.S. gets involved in Iraq. So Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Kuwait is a little tiny country there, but it does happen to share a border with Iraq, and they also share access to the same oil field deep in the ground. So Kuwait takes oil from one side of the oil field that's underground, the same basic pool of oil, and Iraq takes him from the other side. And plus, he had some territory disputes with them as well, and so he invades. So why does the U.S. care about Saddam Hussein invading? Because we were on his side, or we were officially on his side during the Iraq and Iran war. Why do we want to fight him now? Because he invaded some piddly little country. Well, one reason might be oil, but also another reason is that after World War II, there's basically agreement in the world and some international law that says you can't invade countries anymore. And think about it. Other than, I can't think of but one country that invaded another country in the last couple years. It doesn't happen anymore, because everybody knows if they do that, they risk going to war with the world. And that's what Saddam Hussein didn't care about. He didn't care about that the rest of the world would care if you just took over another country. And so we put some sort of limits on him. We tell him you got to get out. If you don't, we're going to invade. And eventually he doesn't leave, and so we invade. And this was like the first war as a person that I've ever seen on TV. There were no wars in my lifetime. I was born in 1960. And in my lifetime, there were no wars in the United States until this one. And it was on CNN. I was in college at the time, and all the dorm rooms were watching it, and everybody was watching it. But it lasted like 3 days from the time that we crossed over into Iraq to the time that Iraq surrendered. It was fairly quick. I mean, there was devastation. People were injured. Oil fields were lit on fire. But then we left. And then we told Saddam Hussein, don't be bad again. And he didn't invade anybody else, but we also put rules like you have chemical weapons. And why were we concerned about that? Because he had used them in the war against Iran. He used them on his own people, the Kurdish people who live in the northern part of Iraq. And so we said, don't do that and stay in Iraq, and we're going to watch you. And we left. Now, then that was under George H. Bush's in his career, and then time passes, then September 11th happens. They had nothing to do with it. A lot of people in the United States at the time get confused about this, but Iraq had nothing to do with September 11th. And then Saddam Hussein, he's always breaking the rules and going places he's not supposed to. But then the United States seems to be worried about him, and we say he's breaking rules. But the official reason we say we went into Iraq is that we say and show images to the world at the UN that Saddam Hussein is building weapons of mass destruction. What's a weapon of mass destruction? Chemical weapons, which we know he's used before. Biological weapons, which are illegal, as are chemical weapons. And even there's a suggestion he might be building nuclear weapons. And we present that to the world, and the world is not really sure if this intelligence is good, so nobody else wants to go in with us, and we pretty much go into Iraq by ourselves. And then we quickly, defeat his army, but then there's resistance here and resistance there, and it's a long war, and I mean, it's only been over since I think 2014. So it's not that long ago that it was over. It took us a long time. But in all that time, and we had been all over Iraq, we found not a single weapon of mass destruction. Not, not any, anywhere. So why did we go? I mean, that's a question a lot of Americans have. Why did we go? And I don't have an answer for you. I'm not exactly sure where we went. It seems like the Bush administration was a little obsessed about Iraq. They, after September 11th, reportedly, President George W. Bush, this first question was it Iraq? And it wasn't. But so, I mean, it seemed to be something on his mind. Maybe there's oil. Maybe he felt like he was going to finish the business that his father started. Nobody really knows why we went. And I mean, we know what they said, why we went originally. Then later on, he said different things like we're here to bring democracy to Iraq, which I mean, they kind of have a democracy, but it's been problematic since the war. So I can't tell you why we went to Iraq. But this Latin American stuff you should look up yourself. But just a quick highlight: Perón and then his wife Evita Perón. They are going to be in Argentina. There's a musical made about the life of Evita Perón. So you should read about that in your book, online. Doesn't matter, but I'm not going to go over it anymore. The second one, liberation theology, is the way of thinking about being a Catholic. It is a philosophy of religion that is popular in Latin America. I'm not going to tell you what they believe, but it was popular way of thinking. And it's important in the history of Latin America, but it's also important in the history of the Catholic Church, because I can see that the current Pope of the Catholic Church has been influenced by this idea. I hear it in the way he talks. I don't think he's completely on board with this idea about being a Catholic, but he definitely says some of these things. So you should read about what they believe in. All right, the last topic we're going to talk about in this chapter is about South Africa and apartheid. So apartheid is a system of racial segregation. Now, if you look at the date on this starts with the beginning of South Africa. South Africa got its independence from Britain in 1948. And the reason it got its independence, whereas it took much longer for other African nations, is because there is a large population of Europeans in South Africa. And so it was basically Europeans handing over power to other Europeans. And if you remember South Africa, there are the people who originally went there, who were the Dutch, who then became the Boers. And now they're going to be called Afrikaners. All right. Those are these Dutch descendants. And then then the English took over and the English people moved there. So there's the English. And also in South Africa, which we maybe I mentioned when I talked about Gandhi, but Gandhi lived in South Africa for a while. He was a lawyer. He practiced law in South Africa and saw how Black people were treated there, how other Indians were treated there, and starts to get ideas. And so there's actually a significant Indian population in South Africa. And then there's the original people who are Africans. They speak Bantu languages. There's like the Zulus and a whole bunch of other tribes. All right. And so when South Africa becomes independent, these white people don't want to lose their power. So they establish a system of racial segregation, kind of like our system of racial segregation, which in 1948 we had too. So in racial segregation, I mean, you can say when it went away, but I would go with the Brown versus Board decision in the 1950s. But In South Africa, it starts in 1948, doesn't end until the 1990s. So what is this system? So like in the United States, it was based on race, and I'm putting race in quotation marks here because, there's no such thing as race, at least biologically. But so there were the whites who had all the power and could do anything they want. Then there were the people they called colored, which isn't the Africans, but are the Indians in the society, and they had less rights than the whites, but more rights than the blacks. And then there's the last group, which they would either call Bantu or blacks, who had no rights and were shoved. If they could live in the countryside, but if they lived in the city, they were shoved into slums, which they called townships. And in all aspects of life, it was the Africans who were the most mistreated. They had the least amount of power. And throughout most of this time period, and so now we're at from about after the war until, well, in this case, until the 1990s. Throughout that time period, the major political party, because they had a democracy, not that everyone could participate, but the major party that dominated politics was called the Afrikaners National Party. So these are the Dutch descendants, and they want to keep power. But they are way outnumbered by the Africans who are native to the land. And those Africans in townships in the 60s and 70s, there starts to be a movement against apartheid. They saw what happened in the United States, and they started to rise up. And most the people who rose up, though, like in these early days, were mostly young people. So they were kids in the townships, and we're talking like, high school age kids like you, but also like little kids, like elementary age kids, who went out and protested in the townships against apartheid. And then the government comes in and shoots them, or comes in and arrests them, then beats them and tortures them. And these are little kids. And then there's adults involved in protesting too, like Nelson Mandela, who gets arrested and put in jail. But over time, these kids, are on TV, and people are seeing what's going on, and the other Western countries had moved beyond this. And there's South Africa still treating black folks like second-class citizens or third-class citizens. And it starts to be trendy in the West. I mean, this was something I was aware of when I was your age. I was a political kid and interested in things about the world, but so I probably paid attention a bit more. But it was kind of like a trendy thing to be against South Africa. Like kids at U of M were protesting because U of M had some investments in South Africa, and there were musicians, talking about South Africa, and there were people, and I think I had one of these, like you could get like these wristbands, or they were kind of like bracelets, and they had the name of somebody who was a political prisoner in South Africa. There was an international movement to put pressure on South Africa to stop doing this. And eventually this pressure comes to a head in 1990 when they finally released Nelson Mandela from jail. So he had been in jail for probably a good 30 years. I mean, he came out an old man and he had gone in a young one, but he was sort of the spiritual center of this movement against apartheid. And he's out in 1990, and by 1994, this apartheid system is dismantled, and he is elected the first black president of South Africa.
Everybody's alright. Everybody's inside. Everybody's on you. And the Samburu. Everybody's alright. Everybody's inside.